Okay, hi and welcome to our next session on semiotics, semology and signification. Today we continue our OMILIA, our ongoing meetings in linguistic anthropology. And today, as promised, we'll be speaking about Charles Sanders Peirce and his work. And of course, a peripheral, introductory, fundamental look and discussion of his work. And we'll be ultimately connecting that to work in anthropology or giving it an anthropological direction. Okay, look, we'll begin by first talking about the person sign. The sign that Peirce suggested is a basis for understanding philosophy and, of course, ultimately language. Peirce told us that the sign is something that relates to something else for someone in some respect or capacity. And that's a very vague and sort of general and overarching description and statement. But if you look at it closely, and we will look at it closely, you see that it has a lot of meaning and opens up the world to seeing things in new ways. So the sign, says Peirce, is something that relates to something else, for someone in some respect or capacity. So I guess the operator there, the strong, salient, significant operator there is relates. When you signify something, when you engage the semeion, or when you semiosis something, semiosi, then you're indicating. When you're indicating, then there's a relation between what you're pointing at and what you're pointing to. Okay, so the person sign is anything that interdependently interrelates with an interpretant. Okay, interdependently relates with an interpretant, so that the interpretant interdependently interrelates with a semiotic object in the same way that a semiotic object interdependently interrelates with it. Okay, so there's a lot of going back and forth, and interdependency. Such correlations serving to engender another sign from the interpretant, and subsequently the process becomes reiterated. There's reiteration, propagation, contiguity, of course, continuation. Okay, so the person sign, so what is it? Peirce taught us that a sign or a representamen, okay, so now Peirce is telling us that there's a thing that's a representamen. It's a chair, but it's something that represents a chair. It's not exactly a chair because, what is a chair? A chair is something that I see in such a way. So it's something that represents the concept chair, for example. Okay, a sign or representamen is something which stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. Okay, it stands to somebody. It's not objective. It's an object, but it's not objective in the classical sense, in the positive sense. Okay. So a sign or representamen is something which stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. Very broad, but... So Peirce recasts the arbitrary link between form and meaning as a third term, okay, which he subclassifies into three contrasting types of ground. We're going to, discuss this, but basically what's happening is there's an arbitrary link between form and meaning. There's an arbitrary link suggesting that, look, there's no physical link. There's nothing saying that a chair should be called chair. It can be called table or potato or whirlwind, or anything you like. And in fact, it is named different words in different languages. in Greek. There are not so many common terms between Greek and Albanian, but I know that one common term is the word for chair. In Greek, the word for chair is karekla, and in Albanian, it's the same thing, karekla, which is interesting, isn't it? Little language sharing there across the border, the northern border of Greece and the southern border of Albania. And if you've ever taken a boat ride from Brindisi in Italy to Igoumenitsa in Greece, and it's not that far. It's the east side of Italy and the west side of Greece. It's very pretty, and it takes you past the Albanian mountains there, and it's really, really pretty. You're along the coast and these huge mountains along Albania. Very pretty indeed. Okay. So Peirce is telling us about the fact that there's an arbitrary link between form and meaning. And this is about meaning, isn't it? Okay. So the sign is about meaning. Okay, so Peirce is telling us that the inaugural rupture, what is the inaugural rupture between form and meaning? Peirce is telling us that, look, between form and meaning, there's a rupture. There's an inaugural rupture. There's a break between form and meaning. It's inaugural. It's salient. It's revolutionary. It's an inaugural rupture. It's a rupture that had to happen. A rupture that does happen. We cannot avoid an inaugural rupture between form and meaning. There is a rupture. We cannot connect form and meaning unless it's arbitrary. There is no physical connection. This makes it ultimately impossible to ever join the two. Physically, says Peirce. An utterance cannot directly express anything, it can only stand for it. It doesn't present, it represents. Its expressive force and meaningfulness derive entirely from its deferred relation to something other than itself. There's a deferred relation. He then goes on to say that meaning can be represented but can never be directly presented. Meaning is never directly presented, only represented, represented. Okay, you cannot present meaning. You can just do your best to present it in another way, to represent. Utterances and other expressions push the mind toward things or ideas that stand apart from them, always a step removed. So there's a deferred relation, and this is the inaugural rupture. We can never break through the veil of representation to the realm of meaning. We can never do this. We can never get to the realm of meaning. Says Plato. Plato told us that, look, everything is a shadow unless we reach higher states of consciousness. Then it's a different story. But in our current state of consciousness, we, as humans, we can never break through the veil of representation to the realm of meaning. We can, at best, propagate the sign, where each sign summons new levels of deferral. And this is not new. This is very Platonic, very Platonic. We see things as shadows. We don't see the real meaning of things. We see an image of things, a virtual image, possibly. And we do not see reality. Okay, as Peirce puts it, so Peirce puts it in this way. He says that the sign stands for something, its object. The sign stands for something, its object. It stands for that object, not in all respects, and it is impossible for the sign to stand for the object in all respects. Absolutely impossible. In fact, very few respects. But in reference to a sort of idea which Peirce has sometimes called the ground of the representamen, the ground. Okay, so he uses this word ground, the ground. And the ground is there. It's grounding the representamen. It isn't the representamen, but it's the ground. The sign stands for something, its object. It stands for that object, not in all respects, but in reference to an idea, a sort of idea. which Peirce calls the ground of the representamen. Okay, so Peirce says that we have a sign or representamen, a representamen that stands for some object in the world by virtue of an idea, Okay, it's an idea or a ground. It's not the actual object, because if we were to objectively, in every sense, objectively look at something, we'd see it in another way. We'd see a chair as something that has a million purposes, and we'd get confused and everything. But in our current associative matrix, we see the chair as something that we should sit on, or put against a door so the door doesn't open, or throw at somebody because we're angry. Okay. So as Peirce describes it, the sign addresses somebody. It addresses somebody or something. That is, it creates in the mind of that person an equivalent sign, Okay, a sign equivalent to the object, or perhaps a more developed sign. The sign which it creates, he calls the interpretant. If we add this new term, we can say that sign form, in order to be a true sign, is associated with three parts: an interpretant, an object, and a ground. An interpretant, an object, and a ground. And you know, it gets confusing again because different people use different terms. But again, I repeat that, okay, we're going over an initial look at Peirce. So, you know, the important thing is that we get the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are these: that there is the representamen, the thing or the person or the event or something that presents itself in some way or another. Our conventional interpretation of this, and our situated personal interpretation of this representamen. Peirce goes on to say that understanding or conceptualizing something proceeds by way of proliferation of signs. Proliferation. Okay. The relation between a sign and its object, said Peirce, is the necessary and sufficient conditions under which the sign may be said to be true. May be said to be true. Not is true, but may be said to be true. And this Peirce calls logic proper. The relation between the sign and its object. So it requires some necessary conditions. And you know, this is also a sign because the relation between the sign and its object requires necessary conditions, and if the conditions change, the relation changes, and if the relation changes, then the conditions change, and this also becomes a sign, right? It becomes motivated in the words of Saussure. The sign is motivated, but it remains in a different form because the conditions change or the relation changes or something. Okay, so that's what Peirce has to say about his sign. Now let's look at the graphical representation of Peirce's sign. And we see a triangle. And Peirce was really big about triangulating things in the graphical sense, not in the methodological sense. He was big about putting things into triads. And, you know, Russian formalism was also intent on, in more frequently implicitly than not, they were big on triangles and the Trinity. And I guess that was a consequence of the Russian Revolution and, you know, things that happened in or Russia in the early 20th century, because Russia was very orthodox and the Trinity was quite an important thing in religion, and that would have pervaded through to philosophy and science and everything. But the Trinity is, you know, it's a religious concept or precept. Okay, so Peirce, and you know, Saussure was a development of Russian formalism, or he interacted with the Prague school and the Russian formalists. Peirce, however, was American, so don't know how closely related he was to the formalists, but surely he was influenced by this idea of the Trinity. All right, so if we look at this diagram, there's an A, B, C. We see a triangle, and in the middle we see a big word, sine, and we see an A, B, C. So at the bottom left we see the object. At the bottom right we see appearance, and at the top we see effect. So going by our terms, Michael's terms, Michael says that, look, there's an object, and it appears in a certain way, then it has a certain effect. Okay, so the object is what it is. That auxiliary verb is. It's quite dangerous, but we use it now quite sparingly. The object, what it is, what the object should be, and what the object actually is. Okay, all right. So what the object presents itself as, what the object conventionally appears to be, and our situated, localized, individualized, unique way of understanding or conceptualizing the object. Okay, so Peirce calls the object a representamen, which undergoes some sort of transformation and it becomes a semiotic object. Okay, and then there's the interpretant at the top who interprets the, which becomes interpreted, and we see it in a very situated way. So that's what Peirce is telling us. Okay, the representamen is a sign vehicle. It's a vehicle for the sign. Okay, without it, then of course there really isn't much. There's no sign. There cannot be no sign without it because it is the ground. It's the sign form. It's the meaning instigator. It begins the process of meaning. It's an artifact. It's artifactual because prior to the sign being motivated, it's just an artifact. It's just a thing that doesn't make any sense. It's what the meaning is about. Well, yes and no. The meaning is about a whole system of things. But at any rate, it's what's at the center of meaning for now. Although later on we decenter meaning, we speak about decentering and everything. It's representation. It is what represents itself. And it's the ground, says Peirce, responsible for signification. If we go to the semiotic object, we note that it has conventional signification. Remember, we spoke about its interpretation is conventional. Conventional interpretation, conventional signification. It's what it should mean. It's what the object should mean. The representamen should mean, conventionally. It constrains, conditions, determines signification rather than causing or generating the sign in conjunction with the environment. And if we go to the top, the interpretant, we see that the interpretant is actually the situated aspect of the object. It's situated signification, situated interpretation. It's the sense that we make of the sign. Okay, it's how the sign becomes sensible to us, how we see it individually, in situated ways. What it really means to the individual. It's the translation of the sign. It complexifies understanding of the sign's object, and it does. It becomes, quite a complex thing because, you see it in your own individual way. Well, yes and no. It complexifies it, but it also simplifies it because you get it. You get the sign in your own way. Okay, and becomes, according to Litzka and Savan, it becomes a translation. I'm going to say a few things about the sign, the object, and the interpretant now, or the representamen, the semiotic object or interpretant. The representamen is interpretable as it says something about something. The representative isn't necessarily symbolic, linguistic or artificial. It can be anything. Okay, it can be an action, it can be a memory, it can be a word, it can be a sound, it can be a fish. It can be, absolutely anything. It's not necessarily anything. For example, a cloud. You can see a cloud and it may signify something like rain or dark skies or, depression or something. The sign stands for the object to be interpreted, and it's the sign's ground. The object, or the semiotic object, as Peirce tells us, it represents the subject matter of a sign, the subject matter of a sign, and an interpretant. It can be anything thinkable, a quality, an occurrence, a rule, even fictional. The object is the universe of discourse to which the partial or special object belongs. So if we take the example of Pluto's orbit around the Sun, for example, and Pluto is now no longer apparently one of the planets in our solar system. It's been relegated to something else, poor Pluto. So if we take Pluto's orbit, the perturbation of Pluto's orbit represents a sign about Pluto, but ultimately not only about Pluto. Okay, so from here on, I'm going to use the three large font terms: object, appearance, and effect. Object, appearance, and effect. Of course, I'm not discounting the Peircean terminology, and I'm not contesting that at all, but there's so much confusion. You can go back and make connections and references and everything, but to keep it simple and to keep from getting confused, we'll call the A the object, the C the appearance, and the B the effect. Okay, object, appearance, and effect. Okay, so the interpretant is a sign's meaning or ramification as formed into a kind of idea or effect. An interpretation, human or otherwise. It's a sign of the object and of the interpretant's predecessor. The interpreted sign as a sign of the same object. It's either immediate to a sign and is kind of a quality or possibility, such as a word's usual meaning, or is a dynamic interpretant, such as a state or agitation, or is a final or normal interpretant, a sum of the lessons which a sufficiently considered sign would have as effects on practice and with which an actual interpretant may at most coincide. So now let's look at what the Peircean sign does. We have our diagram again, our triangle, and it has the A, C, B, and we have the subject at the bottom left. We have the referent at the bottom right and the effect. Now remember, we're calling these the object, the appearance, and the effect. Now don't be confused, just remember that there is interchangeability in these terms, and we will, sooner or later get a grasp on that. Okay, so that brings about a sign, says Peirce. And Peirce tells us that with respect to the sign, we experience the representamen, the object. We experience the A, the bottom left, the object, the representamen, says Peirce. Okay, the representamen directs our attention to the semiotic object. We look at it or hear it, and then we get an idea of what it should mean, conventionally. And the representamen interrelates with its semiotic object. There is interrelation, okay, between the two. Now, when the representamen brings our attention to the semiotic object, there's interrelation of the representamen with the semiotic object, and there's meaning from the interrelated semiotic object, the representamen, and the interpretant. That's where we get the meaning. We get the meaning from a combination of everything working together, an interrelation. So the representamen interrelates with its semiotic object, and the semiotic object itself becomes a representamen. Okay, so the semiotic object actually instigates a new process. So now you can see how the process is working. We have our object, our representamen, and it becomes a semiotic object, an appearance. And the appearance then, the semiotic object, becomes a new representamen. And that motivates the development of a new sign, and this is the propagation of signs. It's a continuous development of sign after sign after sign after new sign and so forth. So the interpretant becomes a representamen and develops its semiotic object, its own semiotic object and interpretant. So every point in the triangle becomes a new sign. And the sign just continues on and on and on, continuously, very quickly, infinitely. So for example, let's have a look at this diagram, which is initially a little confusing, but that's fine, because when we look at it closely and slowly and begin to pull it apart, analyze it, then we see that it's not confusing at all. So we see the triangle at the center, and we see that basically this diagram is just telling us that every point in the triangle can do something new and go somewhere. So for example, if we look at the one at the center, we see that the effect, at the top, the effect, the interpretant, can become, and there's the arrow pointing to the top left triangle, can become a new subject, or a new representamen, or a new object. It can become a new referent. The diagram is also giving us combinations and different permutations. So while the effect at the top can become the subject or the referent or something else, another part of the triangle can become something. So for example, the effect can become the object, the representamen, or the subject by itself, and then take on a new referent and a new effect. It can combine with other parts of the triangle so that it becomes, the effect becomes the referent, and the referent becomes the representamen. Or the effect can remain the effect, and the referent can remain the referent, and there can be a new representamen, and so forth. So you can see, it's just really a way of describing all the different kinds of combinations that any of these three items on the triangle can have with each other, or alone, or with something else. So back to the large diagram, we have at the bottom left the representamen, which is sometimes called the subject, which I call the object. The referent at the bottom right, which Peirce labels the semiotic object, and the effect, the interpretant, labeled by Peirce. The interpretant relates to and mediates between the representamen and the object, to interrelate between them and with them. So what we're told is that the interpretant mediates between, there's mediation between the representamen and the semiotic object. So in order to get what society tells us is this chair, we need to get it in our own way. Okay, and that's mediation. What's mediation? Mediation is a little bridge between two things. Important to know is that the semiotic object is never identical to the real object, since knowledge is never absolute. Okay, so we see the chair, and the chair is something, but not exactly what it is in reality. Well, what's reality? Ontology is not something that we're going to look at now. But the semiotic object is never identical, never, absolutely no, never identical to the real object. Irrespective of how many people we get into a room and we ask them all and we put all their heads together, it's never going to be identical. So semiotically, the semiotically real object that we smell, we taste, touch, hear, see, is never identical to its real object. So, okay, so here's just a small diagram that we're going to just add on so we can better get what's going on with this system or this process. So, okay, so at the left we have our signifier, the artifact, the active object. Now, I use the word active, and the term active is, quite subjective here. The signifier then gives us both a conventional object, it presents a conventional object, and also an alternative interpretation. So it assists us to develop ideas of a conventional object, a representation conventionally, and a representation in our own alternative, unique, situated ways. So, okay, so this becomes signification. The signification, however, becomes its own signifier. And the signifier does the same thing, and that presents a signification, and that becomes a signifier, and it does its own thing. Okay, so it's a never-ending propagation, as electromagnetic theory would put it, propagation. What is electromagnetic theory? Electromagnetic theory is it's the propagation of energy through space by means of electric and magnetic fields that vary in time. So you have electric and magnetic fields that vary temporally, and hence energy becomes propagated through space, okay, in a spatial way. So let's look at some examples. There are 3 boxes, and we'll take one at a time. On the left, we have our triangle again, and we have as our representation or object, we have smoke. Okay, so you see smoke in the distance there above the hills, and what does that suggest? The first thing you think of, or most of us would think of, would be fire. There's a bushfire or something. If you're in the Australian outback, and Australia is very interesting with its seasons because the more it rains, the greater the risk of fire. If it rains very heavily in winter in the Australian bush, then the foliage becomes very thick, and when summer comes along and it's very hot and dry, there's more foliage to burn, and the risk of bushfire and destruction is great. And I certainly experienced that at several points in time, where there were great bushfires and issues and warnings issued to people to get back to their homes in the city. And I know people who lost their homes and lost everything. In fact, my PhD supervisor lost her everything in bushfires years and years ago, and she had to start over with nothing. And she and a lot of other people remained devastated, but these are natural disasters.